Hello and welcome back to the Honest Business Podcast. I hope you are really well. What an episode today. It is the Honest Business Podcast first birthday. Woohoo! Congratulations to me. I'm joking, but it's the birthday. We've been going for a year. So if you've been listening since the start, please let me know. Send me a message. Tell me, have you listened to all 52 plus episodes? Have you not? If you are new, welcome. Great to have you. But yes, we have been at this for a whole year, which is very exciting. And what a time I thought we'd just celebrate and talk a bit about my experience about having a podcast. And then I also want to talk about, should you add a podcast into your kind of market mix and into your marketing strategy for 2023? Because many people are questioning that, wondering that. Some people might have started a podcast and then you might have trailed off and it didn't really get anywhere, you weren't consistent, etc. And you're wondering, maybe I should bring it back. So I've got some thoughts on it. I thought I'd share my personal experience because I know you do like to hear about that as much as I don't often talk about me, but we will do today. And just have a really open discussion. So the Honest Business Podcast is 1 year old and we have been going every week pretty much. I had a couple of weeks off here and there, but going strong, and I've loved recording the podcast. It isn't going anywhere, by the way, so just to clarify, in case anyone's like, does this mean it's finishing? It's not finishing. We will continue, we'll keep going. Got lots of content coming for you. There's amazing episodes recorded. I'm very excited about it. We've got more ideas than ever, really, in terms of episodes. We just don't have enough weeks to put everything out. So really excited. I really appreciate that you listen and that you tune in every week. And I love that some of you have shared with me that I'm part of your rituals, sometimes your midweek rituals, or you have a process where you listen to me in the gym, or you listen to me on the go, or some of you like candles, some of you do your business development. There's a lot of different people have said different things about what you do when you're listening to the podcast, which I really love. So thank you for sharing that with me. In terms of some stats about the podcast, I mean, we've had a really great year. I came into it with zero expectation, really, which I tend to do with a lot of things, what we do in business. Everything's kind of an experiment. I had wanted to start a podcast for probably 2 years before we started it, and it just was always in the pipeline. It had never kind of really just evolved. There was a lot of discussion, which I think I've shared with you in an episode recently, about I felt quite apprehensive about it from a perspective of saying the wrong thing and offending people and annoying people, which we got over and kind of just moved on with. And I discussed that in an episode recently. But I have absolutely loved the podcast and loved kind of creating this. And the biggest thing I've enjoyed about it is this having a long form piece of content and having a long kind of just a channel to really speak and speak at length, about topics, which has been really close to my heart in the sense of I've enjoyed that level of connection. Just as some kind of a few stats, I suppose, 90% of listeners are women. So hello if you are a lovely woman, and hello if you're one of the 10% of men. Great to have you. It's nice to have some men. We don't interact a lot with men in terms of our day-to-day with clients and things, so it's nice that you have some men. And the podcast was global, so over the year it's reached, I think, 24 countries around the world, which is really exciting and really nice to kind of be placed in people's ears around the world, which is very fun. But I'm looking forward to seeing what year 2 holds and seeing kind of where we go and what amazing things can be creative and what great content can come from it, because ultimately the goal of this podcast, which I wanted to really touch on in case people don't realize, because I don't know if we've ever really gone into it that much aside from kind of the first episode, say, the goal of the podcast was a big passion project of mine in the sense of I wanted to create long form pieces of content for people every single week where they could access really high level strategic conversation, which, there's hundreds of thousands potentially of business podcasts. There's loads of business podcasts. The world didn't really need another business podcast. And so I was like, what are we doing it on? Which is why you'll have noticed that there's never been a guest on the podcast. Now, that's not saying I'd never have a guest. I would love to do a season or a series maybe of guests, but it's just not something that it's not been the aim of the podcast. You know, it's not a podcast about interviewing. It's not a podcast about learning about someone else's journey, which they're all great, but there's plenty of them. The purpose of the Honest Business podcast was obviously in the title, to share honestly about business and about people getting a really unfiltered, no bullshit, one take, you know, long form piece of content that was just raw, because that's who I am and that's who we are as a business, as May James Limited. And so I felt really strongly about that. But going back to the idea of why did we start the podcast, a lot of it was that I wanted to make it more accessible, in the sense of not everybody can afford to work with me. And that is something that, you know, I'm quite comfortable with, in the sense of I can't make it, you know, in terms of working one-on-one, there isn't really a solution around that, bar a few potential things that, you know, we look into from time to time. But for me, it was like, how do we have this high level conversation? So the whole concept is that this podcast is positioned in a way where it's the same kind of conversation you'd be having if you were a client of mine, which I really like, because it's like, okay, we just continue the conversation on. And I recommend to clients that they listen to this podcast, because it's a really nice accompaniment to their learning and their coaching and their advisory services and their consulting and all of their kind of growth journey that they're on with me when they're working with me. The idea is that the Honest Business podcast is a nice accompaniment to that. The difference was that I decided that let's just put that out as a free offering for everybody to consume. So there was a conversation at one point where it was going to be a podcast just for clients. And then I was like, no, like, this is a great way. I'm not saying that it's democratizing, you know, high level business advice, but it is to some degree, because that was the aim of it. It was like, how do I get this like level of conversation to everybody's ears? Because in the business podcast space, there's huge waves of just like noise, just like lots of storytelling, and that's great. Like, that's really important. But I do feel like there's a gap, and there still is a gap, right? Like, just because one person's doing it, I don't think that means there isn't a gap. I think it's like we need multiple voices. And this is why I say to anyone who's thinking about starting a podcast, I'm like, do you know what? I probably would go for it. Like, try it, because we need a diverser group of, you know, opinions, thoughts, thought leadership, just perspectives on topics. And so I really enjoy sitting in the space of being able to voice my opinions on those things. And that has made me really, really happy, because it's always something that I can kind of direct people to as a solid resource. And I've had some lovely messages, you know, throughout the year of people who have actioned the stuff we talk about, or have really used and utilized the power of what I share, and then have gone on to implement things in their business, which makes me really happy. And like, that's ultimately the goal, yeah, is to help you guys, to help women to grow their businesses and make more money. And this is just an addition, is the brand of May James. Like, the podcast sits in that as a real key thing in terms of a weekly resource, and it's something that I could commit to doing. So that was a really great option. Anyway, that was my thoughts and my update in terms of the podcast and where we're at with it. And as I say, we're not going anywhere. It'll be in your ears next week as usual, but we are one, which is very exciting. I should have had a cake or something for those watching on YouTube where we could have celebrated, but hey ho, we haven't. But let's just dive in and make it more specific and applicable to you listening, who may be wondering, should I start a podcast? Should I add a podcast into my marketing mix? Should I add it into my strategy? Where does that sit in my strategy? Doesn't make sense for me. So I'm going to give you a rundown. And as we go through the rundown of things, I'm going to put it into context in terms of what it's meant to me, because I think that's helpful for most people. So when you're thinking about, should you start a podcast, in terms of an immediate yes or no answer, I would say for most people it's a yes, but there's quite a few caveats, as in like, why are you doing it? What's the point of it? You know, what do you want to get out of it? Yada, 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 yada. There's a whole thing. If you're just starting a business, would I recommend doing a podcast? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that's necessarily like the thing you need to do. If you are someone who has a big team and has a really successful business, is it a good idea? I'd say probably yeah. But again, it depends on you and your business. So when we think about, should you start a podcast, because it's probably useful to say to people listening, you know, clients of mine, it's a conversation that we have with people, you know, they'll be like, should we start a podcast? Or we're going to start a podcast. Here's the thoughts. What do you think? And they want my like strategy and support around that. And how do we create it so that it's going to be a really successful podcast? And so I'm involved in quite a few conversations around podcasts aside from my own, which is interesting, and I love doing that. But ultimately, that question always comes down to strategy. It comes down to strategic direction. It comes down to why are you going to do it in the first place? So I think that needs to be really, really clear. What is your intention? Why are you doing it? The other thing that needs to be clear is, what do you want to get out of it? And that sounds very selfish, but I think you've got to get clear on that, because how you execute your podcast, how you go about doing it, what you do with it, all lies on the fact of what do you want to get out of it. And I think that's really key, because for me, like, the Honest Business podcast came because I wanted to educate and I wanted to give people insight, yeah? It wasn't about converting clients. It wasn't about, and I'll touch on that as we go through the episode, it wasn't about using it as a networking tool to grow my network. Because again, if you have got no network and you want to grow your network, podcasting's unreal for doing that, and it's fantastic if you want to go down the guest route. So be really understanding and strategic about why you're setting your podcast up. What is the point of it? For me, it was about a give back. It was about, how do I give back, share this message, get it in the hands of more people. I wanted to be so that you could be anywhere in the world, you don't have to pay me anything ever. And if you've, take stuff out of this podcast, you can really change your business. That's what I want. I want people to feel like, amazing. We also wanted it so that clients could listen and then be like, yes, this helps and this connects. Because in my work and what I do, I don't love spending lots of time explaining concepts. I don't mind doing it, obviously, and I will do. But often people don't have tons and tons of time with me. They don't have, what's more powerful? Me sitting explaining a concept for 15 minutes, or having 15 minutes where we are going into their specific strategy for their specific business and what it means for them and their to-dos. The latter is what's useful. So actually, if we can have podcasts and we can have lots of information, people can consume it at their own time, and they can come to me and be like, okay, what does this mean for me? Or I've listened to this and this said this, and how do we implement that? And that's how it's being utilized, which brings me so much joy, because that was the vision and that was what I wanted it to do. And it does that. And I love that it can have that double-edged sword of supporting clients at the same time of supporting everyone. And if you listen to this and you've never bought from me and you never will buy from me, that's cool. Like, how fun, how exciting that we can have this relationship. Although it's maybe one-sided, please reach out so I know who you are. It'd be great to know you. That was my purpose for doing that. But that doesn't have to be your purpose. It doesn't have to be a give back thing. It doesn't have to be an educational thing. For some people, it's about funneling people. Some people, it's about their presence and being able to improve their public speaking. Like, the reason that you start your podcast can be for a whole plethora of reasons, and that is up to you. But you need to understand that when you're deciding whether or not to do the podcast. Then, at the point in which you decide you're going to have a podcast and you're going to do it, I argue it needs to be really, really clear what the podcast is about. I think sometimes business podcasts, the topics are just really random. And what I mean by that is, like, the format changes all the time, or the purpose of it changes, or the message changes. And, I get that things evolve. That's fine. We're not saying that you can't ever change something up. But it's more so about, what is the key structure of that? What is the founding format? And really think that out. You've got to think this through. I think a lot of people just go hell for leather, launch a podcast, record something, chuck it up, and then it's like, oh, and then they do a few episodes and they're like, that doesn't fit. Yeah. I mean, just for context, like, I mentioned before that we'd wanted to do this for 2 years before we launched it last year in terms of the podcast. But in terms of us actively being like, right, we're actually going to do it, we're going to execute on it. Obviously, it launched in March of 2022. In terms of, if you can hear rain outside, I do apologise. It's just started lashing down, which is really annoying. In terms of us actively working on it and strategizing on it, I think we started that around October of 2021. So it was like a 6-month thing. Now, I'm not saying it needs to take you 6 months, but what I am saying is there was a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth, a lot of strategizing, a lot of trialing things to work out what did I ultimately want to get set on. And again, I'm not saying that our format's never going to change and that this is the best thing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that there is intention behind everything we do as a business, and it proves, it pays for itself time and time again, because it allows for whatever we do to be worth it. And when I come on to costs in a moment and how much stuff costs, you will understand why I have to be like that and why it makes sense for us to be like that. But in terms of, let's get clear on what do you want the podcast to be? What is the message? Why are you doing it? And then what is the actual podcast going to be about? And getting that topic needs to be really, really good. I've got a client at the minute who she is going to launch a podcast and the topic's just bang on, like it's so good. And I'm so excited to listen to it because it's really good. I've got another client who launched a podcast last year who, it was a great format and it was really unique and it was really interesting. And it's like, yes, good. Like, this is really cool. And again, that's not to say it needs to be really thought out and really like over engineered or anything. Like, it doesn't. But it's just about being really clear on what are you doing, why are you doing it, what's the format. The other thing to consider when you're thinking about should I start a podcast or not is the question of, do you get a podcast manager or do you get support in terms of producing a podcast? Now, there is many options with this. For me personally, when I decided, when we launched last year, I was very much of the fact of like 100% outsourcing, because for me, which I'm not saying will be the same for you, it was not something I was going to start getting into. Would I love to do that? Yeah, but my job as a founder, as a CEO, is not like sitting editing a podcast. That's just not my my hourly rate in the business is just too high for me to be sat doing that, which is fine, right? And I think it's okay for you to also identify that and say, actually, I shouldn't be doing that, or I don't need to be doing it. So for me, aside from that as well, in terms of my chronic illness, which I don't know if we've spoken about much on here, about my chronic illness and profitability and things like that, for me and my chronic illness, every single time that is spent in the business for me is so crucial and critical in terms of us measuring it and understanding, is it being put to best use? For me, the recording of the podcast was going to have to be the only thing that I did, and everything else was going to have to be drafted off. Does my profit margin across my business be affected by that? Yes, 100%. And that's something I can talk about maybe on an episode if people are interested. I take a hit on that. I don't really have a choice, to be honest. There's no point in me complaining about it. I don't really have a choice. So I have an amazing team, and we have a lovely group of people, a lovely group of all women with a great age range of us, and they support me because I couldn't do what we do as a business without them. If you don't have a chronic illness, maybe you have got lots of time, then you might not need to get any support. And it's definitely something you can do on your own. I've got clients who do it on their own. You don't need to have a podcast manager, or you don't need to have an editor, or you don't need to have this person or that person. Like, you can fully do it on your own. There's amazing apps like Anchor, which has recently been bought by Spotify, I believe, where you can literally download an app, record into it, upload it, and it's done within 10 minutes. Like, there's so many easy, get it out there, scrappy action, messy action, do it for yourself. That is totally cool. It works. It's fine. If the content's good, the content's good. Yeah. So I think this is where it gets complicated, because everyone's like, do I get help? Do I not? If you are someone who's scaling a business, get help. If you are someone who's making multi-six figures and you have got loads of other stuff going on, outsource. If you are someone at 7 figures and, just don't even think about it, outsource it. If you're someone who isn't at that level and actually, or, you have a chronic illness and actually you can't even imagine trying to sit and stare at a screen for however long, then let's, look at other options. And even the thing of getting help, there are so many different options out there. You can go with a podcast agency. You can go for someone on Fiverr, although I've not used that. But, you can use Fiverr and you can find someone, relatively inexpensively. You could create a job role in your business for it. Like, there's so many different ways to get support and to make it work for you based on what you need. I personally have a podcast manager, which is amazing. She is fantastic. Shout out to Lily Hazel. She works with me in the business, and she's also my head of operations, but she does run a podcast agency, and you can contact her for all your podcast needs. She might be full at the time that you, if you reach out, and she might be full. So if she's full, come message me. I'll refer you to some more people, because I have some other people who do podcast edit and management as well, and they are also fantastic. But yes, I have a podcast manager. I will be honest and say, having a podcast manager has changed the game. It is so much easier. I couldn't imagine doing it any other way. It's so simple. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to worry about it. I literally just sit down, record the episode. That's it. Done. I am out. I am out of here. I don't even need to, what's the word? Sign off on the episodes. Now, you might have to do that if I was using a different agency, I probably would. But because I work with Lily, and me and Lily have worked together before the podcast and worked together in other capacities within my business, I don't have to do that, which was a huge, massive thing, because I spend a lot of time signing stuff off and it can be a pain in the bum. And obviously a podcast is a long form piece of content. So because of the podcast style that we do, in that I record in one go, there's minimal editing. Like, she doesn't edit the podcast. All she does is kind of map out if the doorbell goes or something like that. But in terms of the editing, there's not like a massive edit. I purposely did that from a practicality perspective, and also because it was honest business and I wanted to be honest and open and just be like, this is me, this is who I am. We just roll with the punches. So I don't have to deal with that, which was a huge, massive thing, because like I don't want to have to sit and listen to however long and go through and do stuff. Having a podcast manager gives so much agency to the whole project, because it just allows for everything to be so much simpler and easy, and Lily's amazing, and it's just a dream. It's seamless. We are really systemized. We have a really good like SOP, a whole thing about how does the podcast work and everything. Lily has got it sorted. We use Airtable in terms of a management situation, because there's other members within the team who get involved with certain things in terms of like the content and from the marketing perspective. I have assets made for me. Everything's basically done. It's great. It's fabulous. And I couldn't recommend that more. However, obviously that comes at a cost, and obviously you've got to justify and work out in your head, is it worth that cost? Which for some people it's going to be a hell yes, and for some of you it's going to be a no. What I would say is, we don't track an ROI off the podcast, because it's really difficult to, but two, it just doesn't make the sense that it's not something in my business, because we have such a varied expenses. It's not something that I'm sat with a cash book going in and out of, because ultimately there is many things in my business that is like this, where it's like it's a sunk cost and we have to deal with it. However, if you are someone who is watching money and is wanting to know, is it, a lot of businesses, I would recommend trying to work out some kind of ROI or some sort of metric around the money you're investing on a consistent basis. You have to make that decision whether or not it works for you. I would say that if you're listening to this and you've got market and budget, put it into a podcast. It's worth it. The biggest thing for me is the long-term assets of it. That's why I like it, in terms of the idea that, you record an episode once, but then someone might listen to it in 4 years' time, which I do. I don't know if anyone else does, but I do. I'll find a podcast, and if even some of it, I listened to one the other day, it was 7 years old. I still listen to it. How incredible. That person took 20 minutes out of their day, recorded this episode, and here's me listening to it 7 years later. That kind of thing is, I think, where the real value lies. So for me, as someone who runs their business massively driven by long-term kind of planning and perspective and strategic thinking, I don't mind making that financial investment every year, but I understand if you don't. So that's my thoughts on getting help, but I'd 100% recommend getting a podcast manager, or even getting an editor. Editing takes ages, especially if, my podcast, I know, because I know from reference from Lily, who is my podcast manager, my podcast is an easy edit, because of what I mentioned before, we don't really cut anything. Some podcasts, if you're going to do a really intricate kind of process, and you're going to have certain things in it and different sounds and things, or you've got guests and stuff, that obviously takes quite a while to edit. So you potentially are going to be having a hell of a lot of time spent doing that. So if you can, outsource it. And again, remember, you can pay various amounts for that, yeah? Depends on the scale and the level of service you want. But yeah, you're going to be looking at anywhere from a couple of £100 in terms of, I'm not saying for management, I'm saying in terms of if you want an editor potentially, up to £2,000, £3,000, £4,000 a month in terms of podcast management. But everyone obviously varies depending on what you're going to get and deliverables and how much you want to get out of it. What I would say though is just a word of warning / tip, is I would really veer away from the idea of it having to be series. I know that's a thing where people are like season 1 or series 1 and episode 1. And I think that's fine. I think you can do that. But I think, and we had a big discussion about this as a business before the podcast launched, about what are we doing? Are we doing series? Are we not? Are we whatever? I think a lot of the time it's very easy as a business, as an organization, to see it as, right, well, we'll do season 1 and then we'll do season 2 and then we'll do season 3. In terms of audience engagement and in terms of building a connected audience, I think it's really backwards to do that, and it doesn't make sense longer term. Now, for some of you, the nature of the podcast or whatever is going to mean that you need to just do that. You need to do that. But if you can, I think making a long-term commitment of this is going to be a weekly thing, or, maybe you do consistent weekly episodes for 3 months and then you have 1 month off a year and then you do a 3 month, it's fine if you're going to get into a pattern, but I just think having consistency really makes a difference. It obviously depends on what the purpose of the podcast is for. If it's not a kind of educational perspective, then you could argue that it doesn't need to be that consistent. But if you are someone that's in the business of attraction marketing, and part of this reason for doing the podcast is that you want to build leads into your business and you want to have it as part of your top of funnel activity or as part of your nurturing activity, then it needs to be consistent, in my opinion, because it doesn't work otherwise. And I think that's really important for you to get clear in your head. It took me quite a while to be like, right, where are we actually sitting with this? Because at first I was going to do bi-weekly and I was going to do season 1, and then I was like, oh, we'll see what happens. And then it was my podcast manager that was like, can we try it? Like, can we try this? And obviously that depends on what your capacity is as a business owner, your time, etc., etc. But for me, it was a commitment that I was like, once I made it, I was like, okay, that's it. We're going all in. Like, we will do it. Great. Let's make it happen. And, I've not looked back. I've not regretted it. I really enjoy it. And I love that there is, as I've mentioned before, a solid piece of content for people to be able to dive into every single week. And I know now that people are really looking forward to that. And I think, we planned last year to take some time off over the summer, and we planned to take time off at Christmas. If I remember correctly, I don't think we did take any time off in the summer. And we did take 2 weeks, I think, or a week off at Christmas, which was great. And I would do that again. But, day to day throughout the year, it's a weekly situation. I think if you're going to do bi-weekly, fine, like no issues. I think you've just got to really communicate that with your listeners and with your audience. So moving on from that, the next thing that tends to come up, and hopefully this is helpful for you listening, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, how exciting as well. Like, please let me know what your podcast is, what your ideas are, or send me the link if you just launched a podcast. I love finding new podcasts. Equipment and how do you record it and things, that's often like a big issue, isn't it? Everyone's like, what do we do? Also, if I look like I'm distracted, if you're watching this on video, it's snowing outside and it literally looks like something off a Christmas card. It's kind of, for context, I'm recording this in March of 2023, but it's snowing like mad outside. It's just like amazing. It looks fabulous. The equipment part and the recording thing is the next thing that gets people really kind of wound up. We keep it really simple. I know there's many different things you can do and many different options. I record on a Blue Yeti mic, which I think is about 100 quid, something like that. So there is a bit of initial investment there, but nothing like too crazy. You have like I don't know what this is called, like a microphone cover, like a muff type thing that helps with the sound. You want to make sure your room that you're recording in is a good room in terms of the soundproofing and things, but like I'm just recording in my office and I don't have, when I first started the podcast, we used to record with like cushions and stuff, but then I managed to realize that this room's quite small and it's actually all right. You can obviously go to like a podcast studio, which, looks great and looks fab, and that can be really good, but again, that's more of a cost outlay and you decide whether or not that's worth it for you. We looked at doing that and I was like, yeah, let's do that. And as the podcast grows and evolves, that's something that we keep checking in with. But for me, it just doesn't make sense to personally. I think if you have guests and you're going to record in person, it's a great option. But for me personally, I was like, actually, it's logistically, it's frustrating it even more, right? Because it's like more time, you've got to get somewhere, you've got to book somewhere, yada, yada, yada. I just like being really self-sufficient, being able to do it in the house really easily. And then, we've recorded on GarageBand for most of this year. We've recently started video recording the podcast, which was something that took months to get to fruition, which I think again is interesting to share and I haven't shared. So, when I launched the podcast, it was like, let's do video. But what the biggest thing for me was, I think this is such a good lesson for anyone listening in business, about any aspect of business. I knew that all I needed to do was to get something going, i.e. the podcast. And I didn't want to make it really complicated. I want to make it as simple as possible. So we didn't record the podcast, and we didn't for months and months and months and months. Like, what, 10 months or something? 9 months? And that was really intentional, because I wanted to make it so simple so that there wasn't any reason that I couldn't do it. And so even though there was points of last year where marketing wanted us to, my market manager was like, May, can we record the podcast, please? Video, blah, blah, blah. Even Lily was like, yeah, we want to do it. But there was elements where it was like, when is the right time to do it? And for me, it was like, let's just keep this on going, keep it really sustainable, keep it making sense. Then we are now at present day of 2023, which we have started recording the podcast, which is very exciting. And we've landed in a kind of middle of what the kind of longer term strategy, if you want to say, is, which is where I'm recording on my computer. So we're still figuring this out, actually. We're still figuring out the quality of it. I've had all sorts of lighting. We've had different things to try and make the lighting better. I'm recording in the winter, so it's never great. And then my room is also very dark, which I'm moving offices soon. So that is exciting, and we can have kind of a bit of a better setup in there. But I think this is really good to share with people. Like, for you listening, you don't have to have it perfect. Doesn't have to be great. Like, this is just another product of messy action for me. Does it look how I want it to look? Not really. No. Is it as smooth as I want it to be? No. But does it matter? No, because the message is there and what I'm saying is there. And I think with all of this stuff with marketing is, if you think about it too much, you will never, ever, ever do it. So there's an element where you've just got to be like, right, let's go, let's do it. It's good enough. And I say that across the business, because it's so key that we just start doing stuff. And so for me, I am very happy to fly the flag for just being like, hey, it's okay. Like, it doesn't need to be perfect. Nothing ever is. But, you can get some really... If we'd put more resource into this, would it look better? Yeah, hugely. But does that matter in terms of, will someone actually take action in their business? I'm not convinced it makes much difference. So that is kind of where we're at. And so we've switched from recording on GarageBand. We're now recording on Riverside.fm, which is a great piece of software. It's good. Again, it's not perfect. Nothing ever is. Software drives me insane. But it's, it's pretty darn good. It's great. And especially if you've got guests and stuff, Riverside is really cool, much better than Zoom. So in terms of like making it easy for yourself to record, I think that's really key. Like, don't make it hard, make it really simple. I have everything kind of set up in my office. Over here I have a different desk that used to be my podcast recording space, and we used to have it set up just permanently. Now obviously that we're recording it, I kind of have to move around, which does add about half an hour to my recording day, which is slightly frustrating, but that's all right. We make that work. But the moral of that story for me is just to say to you, like, make it easy, make it simple, don't make it complicated. It doesn't have to be perfect. At the end of the day, it's an audio based activity. Yes, people record it, and yes, people like consuming video, and I believe that it is the future of podcasts, but it's still about what we have to say. So don't get too head up on that. We've talked slightly about process and system, in the sense of the reason that I'm able to consistently do this and commit to this, aside from all of the other many things that I do on a week-to-week basis, is that we have a really solid process and system in place. I batch record, which is a huge thing. So I'm not sitting every week with a to-do list saying record this week's episode. I couldn't do it from an energetic perspective. I would really struggle just because of my chronic illness and things. I know some people purposely record their podcast every week and they love doing that. Some people podcast every day. That's just not for me. And so I had to find a solution that would work and a flow that would work. And for us, that is, I record once a month. So once a month, I take a whole day out of my diary and I record. Now, that was a big ask, right? Because like you, listen to this, I'm very busy. And as someone who's running multiple businesses, a day out of my diary a month is a hell of a lot of time. It's worth a lot of money. So it's like, what are we doing? Is it worth it? But for me, strategically, I enjoy it. I enjoy recording them. I enjoy the impact it makes in the world. And I am overjoyed to be able to provide this and to gift people with it. People might not see it as a gift. I see it as a gift for people. And that really fills me with a lot of joy. So that is how that works. I take a day out of every month and I record, which is good. In terms of keeping up with it and being consistent, let's just touch on that again slightly. So I do think it's important to be consistent. I personally don't like it when my favorite podcasts don't post. It's crap. I don't like it. I'm like, oh no, I love this podcast. I want to hear from them. And if they don't post, it's like, oh. So I personally believe weekly is great. I don't think you need to do it by week, twice a week. I think that's quite a lot. I think people need time to be able to consume it. Obviously, if you want to do a daily podcast, like great, amazing. I know some people do that and that's cool. That's definitely a specific strategy in itself and a specific business activity in itself. But yeah, I mean, go for it if you want to do daily. But I think weekly is a really nice time. And I do think bi-weekly, if you want to do it every other week, I think that can work. We did look at doing monthly and I just think it's too sporadic. It's not frequent enough. So personally, I would suggest doing weekly if you can. If not, every other week probably will work. But there's also a big element of this, right, where I want to kind of make this clear that you have to commit to doing it. And when I commit to doing something in the business, we're doing it. So come hell or high water, it's happening. So for me, there's many times in the last year where it would have been easier not to do it, or realistically, I haven't got time to do it, or realistically, there's something else in the business that needs my time that would be more better spent, but I made a commitment that I was going to do it, and therefore, we're doing it. Now, obviously, having a podcast manager helps with that because she can be like, hey, what's going on here? We need this, we need that, and, it's very good that I don't really have to think about it. She kind of just says to me, I need this from you, let's go. But you deciding to make a commitment of it is really important because I have seen a lot of people who start a podcast, get disheartened after a month, can't be bothered, then it doesn't work, or they haven't got the system in place, or they haven't got into the flow of it, which, bear in mind, that takes time, yeah? So don't be too hard on yourself. And then, as the time goes on, they've kind of lost commitment, and then it just trails off. And that's okay, that's fine if that's for you. There's no, shame in it. It's just about identifying that if you are adding this into your business from a strategic perspective, which you should not be, as someone who is a multi-six-figure or seven-figure business owner, listening to this, you should not be just randomly taking on projects and doing random things. You have got, your time is so limited, you have to be acting really strategically. That being said, that means then you need to be consistent, because you're not going to know if this is going to pay off. I would argue that having a podcast is the bloody long-term strategy. And I know people disagree with me on that. But for me, it has been a slog in the sense of it's easy for me and it's fun for me, which is why I've managed to keep it up. But in terms of finding tangible results from a business perspective, or how does it impact the bottom line, it's a long-term strategy. It's worth it in the sense of, that's subjective, but it's worth it in the sense of I like doing it and it's fun. But it is not a quick fix, and it's not a let's do it and it's going to magically transform your business, because for me, that hasn't been the case. For some people, it might be, I'm not trying to speak for everyone. I'm just saying be realistic about what your podcast can do for you, because it's not necessarily going to be like a magic wand where everything's going to be fixed in your business. The other really key part about having a podcast and adding it to your business strategy and your marketing strategy is about your marketing part of this, right? Because marketing a podcast is arguably the important part versus what's actually in it. Now, that's controversial, I suppose, but in the sense of there is many podcasts that are a bit crap, but their marketing's great and therefore they have loads of listeners. And that is the case for many leading podcasts. Some of the stuff is not necessarily the best podcast, it's just they're very good at marketing it. So I do think you have to, if you're going to go down the podcast route, I think you've got to be prepared that you've got to put a bit of effort into the marketing. Otherwise, it is a bit of a waste of time. And I'm definitely not sat here saying that we get this right in terms of where it's some sort of an example of what to do, because we're not. We do not market as a business the podcast anywhere near as much as we could do, anywhere near what we would. We have all sorts of amazing cool things of we could do this, we could do that. We don't actually implement them, or we don't execute on them for whatever reason. There's a whole host of reasons. And I think that's just important to say to you, you've got to take the market a bit seriously. Otherwise it's really a difficult, if people don't know it exists, they're never gonna know to listen to you. Now, obviously, there's amazing outreach platforms like TikTok where you can put your podcast assets on there, and that can hugely grow your business. And if we talk about it from a funnel perspective in terms of funneling potential clients, that's when it can really add a lot of value. I would argue the Honest Business podcast still it serves mostly like existing community. We obviously do get people who find the podcast and then come into the community that way, but for us the Honest Business podcast is more so a nurturing tool, and it's also a tool to convert people, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Increase the time, well, reduce the time if you want to put it that way, for conversion, but it isn't necessarily an outreach strategy. Could we create a marketing strategy that then allowed for the podcast to be that? 110%. We just don't. So I think you've just got to be really clear in terms of your marketing around what do you want to do with it. Again, this is why I talk about the strategy at the start and why you're doing it and what you want to get out of it is so important, because then your marketing will come and provide you with whatever you want it to do, providing you have the right strategy. Obviously, the launch part of the marketing piece of the podcast is really important. We had a really great launch. It was really fun. I think we launched with about 4 episodes, although I could be wrong. I really enjoyed them. Some of those episodes are the most listened to episodes, which I think is really interesting. I think the most listened to episode of the Honest Business podcast is episode number 2, which is all about high ticket sales and the role of high ticket sales in your business. It's so interesting seeing what topics are the most popular and, you know, what comes up as like what works and what people really engage with. But yeah, the launch is important, you know, and there's a whole strategy around that. Like I know Lily, my podcast manager, has a whole service just for podcast launching. So it might be that you don't actually want to get a podcast manager, but you want help launching. She has like a whole service to help you just launch a podcast, which I think is really cool. And I know many other people offer similar services, because the launch bit is really key. Or maybe you want to relaunch the podcast, and it is a really important aspect of it. We ran a giveaway. Trying to think what else we did. Just made a lot of noise, you know, did a marketing campaign around it. Like it wasn't anything like you know, crazy, but it was just good. If top on the charts is important to you, so if you want to get in certain charts and things, then there's massive amounts of strategy you can do around making that in your launch happen. So that's very strategic. That wasn't something I was really bothered about. Nor do we have the audience size to really do that and execute well. So it wasn't really something I was really interested in. However, you can, if you wish to, off the back of your launch, you know, hit the podcast, do really well, hit the charts, like amazing stuff. That's all there in the strategy, yeah? Like you decide what launch you want to have. For me, the launch was, I've got to get people from our other community bases, mainly Instagram, to go into a different platform that they're not used to seeing us on, and getting them used to having them in their regular repertoire. For some people, it was for me, it was also educating people on what is a podcast, and you should listen to a podcast, because so some people in my audience had never listened to a podcast before. We knew that before I launched the podcast. That was part of the 6 months work prior that we did before we launched it. And so I had messages from people saying, I've never listened to a podcast before, but I've listened to this and it's amazing, it's cool, and you've introduced me to the world of podcasts. Thank you. That's what you've got to understand, right? And some of you will think that's very obvious, but you have to understand where is your existing audience if you want your existing audience. Some of you will not want your existing audience, and you're going to want a whole different set of people, and therefore a different strategy is going to work. But for us, that launch strategy that we built over a year ago now was specific, and I was really happy with the results and the outcome we got from that launch strategy, because it really, you know, it ticked the boxes on what I was wanting, or what we wanted the outcome to be. There was some other stuff that came into it, but those were the main kind of pointers that's worth sharing with you around being intentional. Every single thing I do in the business, you know, 99% of the time is very intentional, in one way or another. And this was no different. And it was really, you know, it was a success, and it was amazing. It was fantastic. And, you know, there's listeners now who are still listening, I believe, who listened to the first episodes back then. And then obviously we've picked up lots of new people along the way. I would say growth is different. You know, it's not different, but it's interesting. If you want a podcast that is going to be high growth, you get a lot of listeners, going down the guest route is obviously the best scenario most of the time. Like, it quickens the process up. It makes more sense. You're exposing yourself to audiences. Like, there's whole huge of benefits around having guests on your podcast. Because I went down the route of not having guests, it meant that the growth was slower, in the sense of it relied on just my organic marketing. We didn't use any paid marketing with it. So it was just my organic marketing to pull people in. So that's something for you to think about, yeah? There's also, though, a whole huge argument of people who overestimate the power of having a guest on your podcast, because a lot of people say, I want to have a guest on my podcast because they're really going to help my audience growth. And actually we find, I've found through clients and through knowing various different people that people are not that great at promoting podcasts they've been on. So please do not start a podcast and then think it's going to magically just like open me up to all of these audiences that normally I'd have to pay for, and now I don't because I've had someone as a guest on the podcast. It don't work like that at all. For most people, it doesn't happen like that. But yeah, the launch is really important and it's key. And again, it's about being strategic and having a plan. And like, this was why it took us time to actually make it happen. There's no just like slapdash one day me deciding, right, we're starting a podcast and the next day we launch it. Like, that is not us. It's not how I build a business. It's not how I create successful things. And I'm not saying you can't create something successful by doing it a different way. I'm just saying that you're listening to my podcast and you're listening to my perspective. So I'm going to tell you what I see to work for me, but also for the many people that I've also supported and helped. The next thing to talk about with podcast is around the fact that you do have to be flexible and it is going to evolve, because if you don't evolve with it, then inevitably it stagnates, and that's not great. So as much as I was saying, it's nice for people to understand what they're going to get, to have a format that they understand, to almost be predicting what you're about to say and know that there's something coming for them. It's okay if you do it for 3 months and then think, actually, I've got a better idea. Like, why don't we change that slightly, or develop that, or move that, or change that? And that is natural. It's part of any marketing channel. It's part of any marketing strategy and successful marketing output, that you are going to change and you're going to evolve. And so for us, that has definitely been there. And we regularly review the podcast and review the statistics and the analytics and the reporting, and, see what is going on and what is working. And we tweak things to suit. So pretty much once a month, we will have a conversation about that, me and the podcast manager, and we will kind of just work through on anything that we want to change anything. And then once a quarter, we have kind of quite an overview of looking at it and seeing, just, is it going where we want it to go, and what specifically do we want to change, if anything. So do be open to making things. But I think tweaks is really important, like, you can make small tweaks that really make a huge difference. And that is about it, really. I've probably missed a load of things that you'll probably start thinking you haven't talked about that bit. But if you do have any questions, you can reach out to me on Instagram at may.james_, and I'm happy to answer them. I'm an open book when it comes to stuff like this. I'm more than happy to share. I do want to kind of run through, there was like a couple of questions that I've had people ask me, and so I'm going to run through those and kind of talk to you about my personal thoughts. And as I said, this is my opinion. You might have a podcast and have a totally different perspective and a totally different experience, and that's cool. That's fine. The one thing I would say is I think most people's podcasts are really unique and different to them, in the sense of, like, one person can have one experience and another person have another. And it's often like not really measurable, some of it. Like, some of it's just a bit like, okay, that happens for them, but it doesn't happen for me. And I think that's okay. It doesn't have to be not, sometimes things are just not that, they're not as clear and they're not as black and white as you may want them to be. So in terms of learnings from podcasting for a year and being a podcaster, which I so love, I so enjoy being a podcaster. I'm so pleased that you listen to me and you want to hear what I've got to say. And I really adore it when you actually take the information and apply it. So please, please, please let me know. Let me know what you've been doing over this last year, listening to this podcast. Let me know, has it impacted your business? Have you, disagreed with me? Are you on a journey of like building your business and scaling your business? Did you find me from the podcast? Did you know me before? Like, I'd love to know any feedback. I really appreciate it. Anything you'd like to hear as well. on the podcast, anything that we haven't covered that you'd love to kind of delve further into, please let me know and I can add it to the ever-growing list of episodes to record. But in terms of the questions that people want to know, so people basically want to know, is it good for lead generation? And my answer to that is it depends, which I know is an answer that gets banded around business a lot, but it does depend. So is it good for lead gen? Yeah, it is. I wouldn't say it's going to fill your funnel. I wouldn't, for me. And again, I'm talking about this from my perspective. If you have a podcast that is getting 100,000 views a month, which mine isn't, nowhere near. But if you're getting 100,000 views a month, then, marketing statistics will tell us in itself, you convert 1% of them. Yes, of course, it's going to be a lead, good for lead gen. So it's the whole debate, as the long lost will always be, around, volume and about how do we, if you've got a load of people listening to something, you're inevitably gonna support your business to some degree. So if you've got 1 million people listening or you've got 100,000, then yeah, it's gonna. But for the most people and for the average Joe and for most businesses, is it good for lead gen? I think it can be, but I think don't come into it thinking that this is going to fix your lead generation problem, because it ain't, especially not fast. It's not going to. And I feel quite confident in saying that. However, is it helpful? Does it help to convert potential customers? Yes. Yes, it is. And I have found, now this is not quantitative data in the sense of, I haven't got any, it's quite difficult for us to track the point in which someone finds the podcast and then converts. But I have kind of data that people have shared with me and have, that we can track some degree. It's somewhat of a meta-analysis, would you say? Although not a hugely valid or reliable one. That yes, the podcast has helped to convert people much quicker than if we didn't have it. Mainly because people can go and just binge it, right? Yeah. So someone's going to come and work with me and then they get the fear of like, is this woman a scam artist? Is she weird? Why am I going to drop 15 grand or 10 grand or 5 grand or however much they're going to spend with me? Can we trust her? Is she who she says she is? Does she know her stuff? Like, people can go and sit and listen to hours and hours of me whittering on about business and they come to the conclusion of, well, she talks like this at such a speed in so much detail for however many hours. It helps build that credibility. It helps people get to know us. It helps people trust us. And, the whole no like and trust thing. The podcast does it all to some degree. And that's what is really special about a podcast. So does it help with conversion? I would argue massively, massively, massively yes. And we have seen that play out multiple times over in the business for multiple different clients. And some people will come and tell us that, some people will be like, I've listened to your podcast on repeat for the last 6 days. I've got to come work with you. And that's an interesting argument. Yeah. And when we go back to me talking about, are things worth the time investment and are they worth the financial investment that I am putting into it? That's part of the, you bring that ideology into part of the decision making around that, of whether you say that it is or it isn't. Is it a good nurture tool? That's another question someone said to me. So from a nurturing your community perspective, is it good? I would say 110% yes. Yes. And for me, so one day I might talk through our marketing strategy as a business and our content strategy, because it is complex and it is layered, but we have a lot of our content, which is nurture. We as a business make nurturing content a big part of what we do. And I choose to do that and I enjoy doing that, and that's nice. And the podcast has played a real pivotal role in that in the last year and has really kind of allowed it to extend outwards and be less immediate. What I've enjoyed about the podcast is that it's a nurturing device that works, for days after, for the whole month, like so much of the content that is created on social is just so instantaneous, and then it's gone within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 24 hours, 3 days if you're lucky. Whereas this does hold a lot more weight to that, and so I really enjoy that and like that. And it has really helped as a nurturing tool. I love that it's something that, if people choose to not work with us anymore because, they don't need to, or they have decided that they've had enough or like whatever, that they can still continue the relationship with me. And yes, that's one-sided to some degree if they don't kind of reach out. But I know that there's, people who have been in our world who are still using the Honest Business podcast as their tool, as their guiding force, instead of like, they don't maybe see me, but they are using that. And that inevitably means that they come back around, yeah? And people have said like, right, that's been really useful for me. And then now I've got this issue with my business, please can you come? Or now I've got this dream that I want to make this happen, or now I've got this goal, can we work together again? And so from a nurturing perspective, from both a person who hasn't bought or a person who has bought, it's really worked very, very well, which is great and lovely. Is it helpful for clients as an additional resource for them, which was something that I've mentioned before about why I did that as a business? The answer, and someone asked like, well, has it worked? Yes, it's been massive. It's been massive on a time front for me, which I've really enjoyed. So it's so much more better for me to be able to say to someone, go and listen to episode whatever, and then come back to me. It's just a better experience. They get a more detailed approach. They get a better kind of understanding. They get to hear more context around things. And then they also get the benefit of us being able to go backwards and forwards together and talk it through, which is so powerful and so useful. And so that has been a real dream come true, to be honest, in the sense of giving clients additional resources for free. And it's really been helpful. And there's a lot of clients who listen to every single episode. And there's some clients who don't listen to every single episode, but it's therefore the point in which they say, right, I want to start a podcast. I can be like, okay, let's go and listen to episode 50, whatever this one is, 52 or 51 or whatever it is. And, you can, that's there as a resource. And I really, really like that. And it just extends. It extends the conversation, extends the longevity of the work we're doing and the depth of it, which I really enjoy. Is it a quick fix? No, it's not. It's not a quick fix. Would I recommend it? Yes, 100%, but it is definitely not a quick fix. It's also not, someone said to me like, well, I know they didn't say to me, someone had sent me an article saying that podcasting is the ultimate lead gen strategy, and this was in 2022, and I sort of laughed. And for me, it isn't. I can totally see how it would be, again, if you go back to volume and you've got, a massive TikTok account and it's the podcast TikTok account, and, you're having a great time with that, like, great, cool. There's so much you can do with it. And, you can put it on YouTube, which is what we have done. Part of putting it on YouTube was an idea that just to make it more accessible for people, because for some people, downloading it can be really challenging if you're in a certain country or data and things like that. So we put it on YouTube because that actually is more accessible for a lot of people. And also we're doing video once it catches up. We're still on playing catch up a bit with that. But yeah, that was kind of, for us, the thinking behind that. What else was there? I'm just looking here on my notes if there was any other questions. Oh, someone put, what is the hardest bit about doing the podcast? I don't know. What's the hardest bit about doing the podcast? Don't know. I don't really find much of it hard, to be honest. I like talking. You can talk for England. Probably the time, to be honest, because time's like my most precious thing, and I can't make more of it. And so, yeah, it's probably the time. But it's one day out of a month, and we have it planned in from now till the end of the year. I know what day I'll be recording them. It's very systemized, but it's always the time proportion of it. I suppose you could also say one of the hardest bit is the marketing piece, just in the sense of, if you had all the resource in the world and all the time in the world and all the inclination in the world, you could run a successful marketing strategy for a podcast. You could have someone running that as a full-time job sort of thing. So it's, and doing it very well, but it's a never-ending thing. And it's like everything in business. It just never ends, in the sense of there's always opportunity. There's always more you can do. There's always more you could make happen. And so that inevitably, for someone who is very focused on impact and things, is tough, because the answer is often make the commitment, make the investment, make the this, because it makes sense, but you've got to strategically be sensible. So that would probably be the hardest bit about the podcast. And then the final question on here is it worth the time commitment as a busy business owner? Which we've kind of touched on, but yeah, it is worth the time commitment, but I think you have to be very strategic and very clear in what you're doing. And as I've mentioned, I delegate everything. Apart from me sitting here recording it, every single thing else is done. I don't really touch it after that. And if I had to touch it in between that, then the argument would potentially be, no, it isn't worth it. But it's also one of those chicken and the egg things, because for me, in my business, it is there as a long-term strategy versus an immediate solution strategy. But yes, that is the thoughts on my on podcasting, and it's our 1 year anniversary. And if you are wondering whether you should start a podcast, my answer is probably yes if you fancy doing it. But be strategic about it. And if you want help to contextualize it, that is something I can help you with. I mean, I would say you're better off coming to me in terms of I was thinking, right, you could come and do an intensive with me, but don't come in. There's no point in you paying me $2,000 to sit and do your podcast strategy only. We could do podcast strategy and we could build out your whole marketing strategy in the sense of understanding where does everything play with each other and what comes into it. And maybe you've already got stuff going on and you're like, well, how can I optimize it? And then looking at your sales funnel and understanding where is all of that playing in that, and how do we balance it out, and how do we increase sales, reduce your lead time, stuff like that. Then you can do a strategy intensive. But if you're someone who has all that strategy kind of in place and ready, I would say, investment wise, go and get yourself a podcast manager, a podcast assistant, a video editor, somebody to help you with it somewhere along the line, and get you moving, get it launched, and share with me your podcast. If you have a podcast and you listen to this, share it with me. I'd love to hear all about it. So that is all for today. I will speak to you next week. Take care, and I'll speak soon. Take care. Bye.